Okay, I'd like to bring this meeting to order. The Village of Villa Park Committee of the Whole meeting, August 28th, 2023. Clerk Konecki, please call the roll.
Trustee Silla, excuse me, wrong name here. Trustee, I got the wrong name. I'm sorry, I've got the wrong name. Cordova?
Here.
Trustee Corkery?
Here.
Trustee Kozar?
Here.
Trustee Komar? Who are we missing? Trustee, I know, this came off the wrong one. Okay, let me see. Trustee Patrick?
Here. Trustee Alfano, too.
And Trustee Alfano. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I have a different record here that I have to update quickly. Thank you very much. And President Cazone.
Here. Okay, will you please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, item number 3 on our agenda is public comments. Do we have any public comments? Okay, seeing none. We'll go to item 4A. Is a presentation by Ansel Glink on Robert's Rules and Council Procedures. Tonight's presentation will be by Carrie Lynn Kraftheffer of the Ansel Glink Law Firm. She encourages a robust question and answer session. Ms. Kraftheffer has spent her entire career representing Illinois municipalities, townships, park districts, library districts, and school districts, and their officials in the day-to-day matters that arise, including corporate matters, labor and employment matters, tax objections, as well as in litigation. And Carrie Lynn, if you have the floor.
Well, great, thank you, and I'm impressed. You actually pronounced my name correctly. So my dad's name is Carrie, and my mom's name is Marilyn, so I have this hyphenated first name. And then when you combine that with Kraftheffer, I left a message once for someone to call Carrie Lynn Kraftheffer, and the message he got was to call Carrie at Lens Crafters. I was wondering why he never called me back. So welcome. So I'm with Ansel Glink. I'm a partner there. Our law firm represents about 250 public bodies. We are either regular or special counsel to about 70 municipalities. I've been representing public bodies for 35 years, so since I was 3. And I'm one of the co-authors of the Municipal Handbook. And there are 2 reasons I'm especially happy to be here tonight. First of all, Villa Park, from what I've been able to determine, is like a normal municipality. And for some reason, I think the reason is that my law partners are a lot smarter than I am. The clients that I get sent to are ones where like the city council is suing the other half of the city council, or the manager suing the village, or the mayor suing the council. And it's like, oh, I get to go out to a normal municipality. That's good. The other municipalities I represent are recovering from their previous administrations being thrown in jail. So it's really good when you go out to a client and they're like, oh, here is a list of employees the FBI told us to fire. It's like, sometimes it would be better like creating governments from scratch. But the second reason I'm happy to be here is that DuPage County is home to me. So I was born in Elmhurst. I lived in Downers Grove till 4th grade. Then I lived in Naperville and Oak Brook. My dad used to be a trustee in the village of Oak Brook, and I am a recovering York Township trustee. So from many, many years ago. So when I was driving down here, it's like I remember walking precincts here many, many years ago. So your manager reached out to DuPage mayors and managers because we do a lot of training for public officials, and we are the attorneys for the municipal clerks, and we've been doing a lot of training for village boards on different issues. So I think I'm going to give you an overview, but if you have questions, we can just make this really informal. And if I'm talking about something that raises a question for you, just let me know and we'll take it from there. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover really. The powers and limitations of your offices, board meeting procedures, transparency laws, and ethics and conflict of interest. So this is just kind of an overview of most things that people need to know. Now, how many of you have been in office for more than one term? A couple of you already. Okay, all right, great. So the first thing that you really need to know is whether you are home rule or non-home rule, your form of government, and the powers of your office. But I'm talking about representing some crazy boards where there's a lot of conflict. That's mostly because their elected officials don't know their relationships to others within, like, how are we supposed to get along with staff? How are we supposed to interact with each other? So we'll touch on all those tonight. So first of all, you probably hear about home rule governments and non-home rule. And I wanted to talk talk about what that means. So the simplest way to say it is that if you are a home rule municipality, your government cannot, you can exercise any powers unless the General Assembly has said you can't. Non-home rule is the opposite. If you want to exercise a power, there has to be a law that you can point at to show where it says you can do it. So that sometimes is helpful to know when you're talking about the roles of different officials in municipal government. Because if a clerk wants to do something, where does it say the clerk can do that? If a village president does? Now, there's a little trick with that. But first of all, Villa Park is non-home rule. And all municipalities that are over 25,000 in population are home rule unless you've adopted a referendum to take that away. Is that what happened here? Were you home rule and you lost it because your population went below 25, or did you have a referendum?
Yeah, that's because our population went low.
Okay, yeah.
But it was small. And I think, and actually, I think a few years ago, there was a referendum about going home rule, and it was voted down.
Okay.
Lombard is over 25,000 and has voted not to be home rule.
Oh, yes, Lyle did that too. So
yeah.
sometimes, yeah, I do a whole class on how to pass home rule referendum, and it really has a lot to do with whether or not the electors trust their governments. Yes, sir.
Our population, according to our last census, is getting closer to the 25,000 that we are now.
Okay.
My question for you then is by the next census, when we find out that our population is probably going to be right around that 25,000 mark, does that automatically put us in there, or do we have to referendum that?
If your population goes over 25,000, you'll automatically be home rule, but you need to pass an ordinance adopting the census results. So it's pretty easy.
Okay.
But then a referendum is not required.
Thank you.
Sure. But what I was talking about home rule powers, there's a rule called Dillon's rule, and Dillon was a justice on the Iowa Supreme Court, and he was analyzing a case on governmental powers, and he came up with this rule that for a government to exercise a power, you have to be able to find a law that says you can. But then, see that extra clause there, or it must be reasonably implied? That's a lot of gray area that comes in here. So sometimes there might not be a law that says everybody can do every little thing. Like, for example, there's not a law that says a police department can purchase police cars, right? So that would be an implied power. So sometimes that comes in. But you are non-home rule. Now, on top of being non-home rule, we need to know about your form of government. Now, in Illinois, there's 6 forms of government here. And while a lot of how you operate is very similar to a trustee village form, you are actually a statutory manager form. And this gets confusing a little bit, because sometimes in that second category, the trustee village form, they hire an administrative officer called a village manager, but it's just an employee of the village who doesn't have powers. Under your form of government, because by referendum, the voters of the village adopted a manager form of government, your electors decided that they wanted to actually have a manager with special powers who would run the day-to-day operations of the village. So that's a little bit different. Now, on the bottom, strong mayor, I always talk about this because a lot of mayors think if they are powerful, they are a strong mayor form of government. But it's actually a very rare form of government in Illinois. There's only about 6 towns that have it. So if you ever hear mayors saying they have a strong mayor form of government, they probably don't. In any event, you have statutory manager, and then we'll talk about what that means. Now, your executive branch, as you know, is your village president. Now, because you have a manager form of government, some of the powers that a village president would have in your instance are actually exercised by the village manager. But the Illinois Municipal Code still says that the village president is the official head of the village for all legal purposes, and you actually have codified that in your village code for Villa Park also. As you know, he presides over board meetings. Now, it's interesting, you have given your village president some powers in your village code related to board meetings, and they are specifically related to preserving order and decorum and to decide points of order, which also probably parallels the village's adoption of Robert's Rules of Order, because some of the language that you have in your village code follows the language in Robert's Rules of Order, which isn't in the Illinois Municipal Code. He has the ability to clear people out if they're causing disturbances or disorderly conduct. And it seems like you really have not had a lot of problems with that. We have a downstate community that we represent that has a person who's very vocal in transgender rights, who shows up in a bikini and swears at public officials and, public comment, sometimes even protects profanity in some instances, so it's really challenging. But if you do have a situation where you're not able to conduct your board meeting business, the village president would have the ability to suspend it, clear out the room, or clear out certain individuals. He also serves as the liquor commissioner, and he has the access to all village records. Excuse me. Also, voting is a little bit interesting when it comes to village presidents, and your village president's right to vote hinges on the form of government that you have. And because you are statutory manager and you elect your trustees at large, the law says that the village president votes on all matters. So that's unique, because in other Illinois municipalities, there's only usually 3 instances in which the village president can vote. He also has the right to veto. He makes appointments to boards and commissions, and that's another thing that you've codified specifically in your village code. And he has the ability to sign permits, revoke licenses, and as we know from the past 2 years, declare a state of emergency if there's a pandemic or some other problem that happens in town.
Just a quick question. Going back to where it's the president is the liquor commissioner, but that's basically the state law though, right?
Yes.
The village president or mayor is the liquor commission automatically.
Yes. Yes, that's true. This does not apply to you. These are the 3 instances that sometimes, well, when does the president, I didn't even finish it, vote? That's sometimes, if you've heard that, that does not apply in your particular form of government. Now, the legislative branch, the trustees and village board. The statute actually has in quotes that the powers of the trustees are purely legislative. So that really means when it comes to passing ordinances and resolutions, motions, things like that, and kind of creating the policy and direction of the village, that's the job of the trustees. You also have the ability to determine your procedural rules, and you've done that. You've adopted some in your village code. And one thing that comes up a lot is that sometimes legislators don't realize their powers are collective and not individual. I remember I received a phone call once from a village manager who said, we have a problem here because we have a village trustee who just went out and talked to the people paving our parking lot and told them to put in a basketball court next door to Village Hall. Okay, so individual trustees don't have the ability to contract or direct things like that. I had another municipality where the city council voted to award Commonwealth Edison its electrical contract. And someone in the public works department decided, the guy from Direct Energy showed up and had him sign a contract, and he entered into a contract with Direct Energy. Direct Energy came in and canceled ComEd, and we ended up in litigation all the way up through the appellate court that says, no, the individuals don't have the power to contract unless it's delegated, right? Now, you do have instances where you have delegated your village manager with the power to enter into contracts, and that's actually one of his duties. But individual board members don't have the power to do that. Also, you have access to whatever records you would need that are necessary to carry out your legislative duties. And in instances where the village president makes appointments, or you also have instances where you have appointments made by your manager, you have the important function of advice and consent over appointments. So you do have a say in that process. The administrative branch is the manager. Now, he is really the CEO and the administrative head of the village, so he's running everything on a day-to-day basis. The craziest story I have about trustees not understanding their role is in one municipality that we represent. The trustees are all unemployed, and they all have offices at Village Hall, right? So they come in on a daily basis, and they're trying to direct staff what to do, and it's just a disaster. And it won't be surprising that they have a really hard time keeping a manager employed because they're not staying in their lanes, right? Things are out of control there. It should be the manager running the day-to-day operations, overseeing all the departments generally, but of course, like with the police department, you have the police chief and a chain of command there. With the fire department, you have that. But generally, in a municipal manager form of government, the manager would handle hiring, firing, any kind of day-to-day issues like that, along with the mayor, enforce all the laws and ordinances. Of course, that usually is handled by the police department. The manager is to attend all meetings and to take part in discussions, and really, it's his job to implement the policies of the board and find out the best ways to do that and bring recommendations forward to the board on projects and contracts and day-to-day operations. He's also in charge of preparing the budget, and then you've delegated ability to him to enter into purchases and contracts, and of course, the payment of those, the parameters would be set in the budget by the village board. The village clerk, in your instance, you have very unusual language in your village code about the village clerk. It says that your village clerk is elected, but she's elected because she was elected prior to the time that the manager's form of government was adopted in Villa Park. So there must have been something historically weird there. But you have an elected clerk. Some towns have appointed village clerks. She attends the meetings, takes the minutes, maintains books and records. She maintains the official corporate seal for Villa Park, and she also would attest to documents and sign them in certain instances. My worst village clerk story is we had a situation where the clerk was at odds with the rest of the board, and she would write down the minutes, and the minutes would if you ever had a situation where people would not put things on the agenda for you, the board can call a special meeting, and they can have their own agenda. And I did represent a crazy township once where the supervisor took the position that nobody could put anything on the agenda. So I told the trustees to call a special meeting. So they called a special meeting for Thursday night at 7 at the park, or at the township office, and then the supervisor would call us, who could also call a special meeting, would call a special meeting for the same date and time at a different location with a different agenda. Needless to say, that ended up in litigation. But it's always better to avoid that if you can.
For committee of the whole, it's specific that two board members can request something
And that, let's see, I believe it's 3 trustees that can call a special meeting, but that's nice that you have a more informal process. And that's also good to hear that if 2 people come forward and want to have something on the agenda, that you're open to that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the other issue that comes up is who can make motions or not. And there is a very famous case that came out of Oak Brook Terrace about 30 years ago called Rudd versus Serralo, where the mayor, people would pass motions to the mayor, and if he liked it, he would read it, and if not, he would crumple it into a ball and throw it away. So the appellate court had to tell him he couldn't do that. So luckily, that's been established law for a while now. So anyway, so the best thing about board meetings is to be prepared for them. And I've had situations where, and this happened in a township that I'm still kind of scarred about. They had trustees that would prepare for the board meetings, but they want, and the meetings were recorded and broadcast throughout the township. So the trustees felt like unless they talked for a very long time, their constituents wouldn't think that they knew what they were doing. So they would just talk and talk and talk. So I've noticed with communities that record their meetings, 1, they're a little bit longer, and 2, generally the officials are better dressed because they know they're on TV. But it's what the trustee who was asking the most questions didn't realize is she was saying this to come across as if she was knowledgeable and important, but it made her look totally unprepared because she had the board packet for 4 days. She had all these questions, and they would have been simple questions to ask the township staff about ahead of time. But instead of doing that, she wanted to play the gotcha game. She wanted to actually embarrass and humiliate people, and that is just not good government, and it doesn't look good. And sometimes it makes the officials that are doing that look like they're grandstanding, but that's another way to get, to drive staff out of town and stuff. Remember that your board meeting time is for debate and not questions. You're supposed to debate the pros and cons of taking a certain action, not to first start doing your homework about the background of issues. That's something that board members forget sometimes. But the other thing is remember that people are watching you. And I just talked about the community that lost all their department heads recently. You don't think other municipal staff are talking about that? Do you think they can find an administrator when, all the city managers talk and they all know, oh, this town is crazy, don't go there, or whatever. So you have potential prospective employees watching you. You have developers watching you. And municipalities are known to be crazy. Do you think they're getting any economic development funds? No, not at all, right? In Lyle Township, they, a couple weeks ago, did a vote of no confidence in their supervisor. And DuPage County pulled the ARPA funding from that township because they're like, no, that they're fighting with each other. We don't want to be involved in that. So other municipalities are watching you, other public bodies, prospective employees, economic development, and then your voters too. And voters appreciate towns like, Villa Park has been getting along. That's great. Just stabilize that and run with that because it's really hard to bounce back from the stigmatism of being crazy once you're pegged as a crazy municipality. Board meeting decorum. So under Robert's rules, the village president controls decorum. And you've adopted Robert's rules, but you've also included in your village code that your village president controls decorum during meetings. And what does that mean? These little subtopics here are all things under Robert's Rules of Order when it comes to decorum. And, I haven't really sat down and read Robert's Rules of Order recently, but I did in preparation for this. And I was shocked and mortified because so many of my clients have adopted Robert's Rules of Order, but they're so much more informal, right? And what we have to remember is Robert's Rules of Order was written hundreds of years ago, and it was directed at deliberative bodies who are continually in session. like the General Assembly, not smaller boards. And I was happy to see there are provisions in Robert's Rules that actually talk about how things are more informal with some of the boards. But remarks are confined to the merits of pending motion. So if it's a motion to adopt or not adopt an ordinance, you should be talking about that, not about the history of all things related to the topic that the ordinance is about. And that's one thing my clients do a lot. They go down a lot of rabbit holes about history. You're supposed to refrain from attacking motives of whoever's speaking, address all remarks to the village president, avoid use of members' name. I violate most of these things when I'm at board meetings, I think. Well, no, I don't attack people's motives, but people tend to be very informal and conversational.
So one of the reasons for that, don't say people's names, is you're expecting to say the senator from the state that has corn or something like that. So I know, I was reading that too. I don't know when else you're going to call everybody on the board, so I don't know how that will help.
It'll be Trustee Corkery.
Well, yeah, no, that we can do.
Yeah, not Sally or Jim or Bob, or, I mean, sometimes, and this is usually
good about
downstate townships doing that. Well, downstate township boards are all related to one another, right? But, yeah, and so my law firm has just been really wrestling with some of the complexities of Robert's Rules of Orders, and one of my partners, Stuart Diamond, actually prepared a very streamlined version of Robert's Rules, which some of our clients have adopted. So if you're interested in a more simpler thing, we can get you that. I mean, he would be happy to give that to you, because it cleans up some of these really hyper-precise things. The other thing it said is you have to refrain from speaking adversely on a prior motion. So if people are, I guess, bemoaning something else that the board has done previously, don't speak like that. And when I look at these rules, it's like, gosh, so many of my clients are going off on these tangents all the time. I might have to do a refresher course for everybody. All right, this is the proper procedure for board debate. If there's a motion and a second, each trustee has the ability to speak once on the issue, and that should be whether or not something is passed or not. There's like a 10-minute speaking limit. Once all trustees have spoken once, then a trustee can speak for a second time, but they can't speak more than twice. Speakers are supposed to be recognized by the village president before they address the board. And I threw this last part in because I feel like this is what all my boards do. Debate is not supposed to be a conversation between board members. A lot of times a motion will come up and people have questions and they'll start talking and then everyone's talking back and forth. And as you can see, that's very different than how Robert's Rules of Order actually thinks that people will handle these issues. All right, we briefly talked that debate should be confined to the merits of the pending motion for or against. Remarks should go to the chair. No personal attacks, but it's okay if there are divergent opinions. And the president has the ability to close debate or he cannot close debate if there's a trustee who wants to speak and that person has not yet spoken. Now, if someone has already spoken twice and wants to speak again, he can close it off unless the body makes a motion for an exception to allow someone to keep speaking. Yes?
Thank you. Each board member, you said, has 10 minutes total each time that they are willing to talk, or is that 10 minutes per time? So like the first time, if I wanted to debate, I have 10 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, unless, I don't think you've adopted a rule that's different than that. It says 10 minutes unless you've adopted a different rule.
So then debate happens, I get my second time to talk. Is that another 10 minutes, or is that a cumulative?
Cumulative? It doesn't say. It just says the first time for 10 minutes, and then, I mean, you probably would need as long as you need to address whatever it is that you're going to address. But you don't really have like a filibuster, like, kind of process.
Okay.
Thank goodness, right? Yes, sir.
Are you done? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, go.
Someone has spoken twice now, and then we've gone through, and the trustee would like to speak a third time. Is it okay for the chair to say, I'll give you the chance to speak a third time? Or is it up to the chair, or should it be up to the board?
Well, it should be up to the board,
Okay.
usually, to do that.
Okay.
But,
And then we would just make a motion to let them extend one, and then if they go back again, do we have to make another motion?
Well, you can make a motion to like let everybody extend the rule. That motion would have to pass by a 2/3 vote, or you can make a motion to allow the person to speak the third time on the topic. Or if this is something that's coming up repeatedly, you could just adopt a board rule that's different than Robert's Rules of Order, if that's what you want to do. Is what's happening? Are you all being cut off when you're trying to speak all the time, or?
No, it's usually, if there's a debate going on and like a back and forth, sometimes when someone speaks, they'll think of something a third time, so we really have not enforced that at all.
Yeah, and that's pretty common, because like I said, people adopt these rules, but then they throw them out the window, and it's a whole conversation between everyone.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need to rein that in, and yes, you would be the one doing that, because that's under the umbrella of decorum, too. Parliamentary procedures. Yes, so you've adopted these, and you also do have procedural rules in your village code, but they seem to mirror Robert's Rules of Order. If you wanted to deviate from them, you can, and I can send you the modified rules that Stuart Diamond came up with, because you might be interested in those. Voting, your votes have to be recorded in the minutes. All votes have to be taken in an open meeting, no secret ballots. No votes by email. I have one municipality that they contact the clerk, and then they want to do these votes by mail, and I'm like, you guys, the Open Meetings Act has been in effect for so long. So you should do a roll call vote anytime you're expending funds, and if you ever don't know if you should take a roll call vote or a voice vote, I would recommend an individual roll call vote, just so you have your records complete. And I'm not going to touch a lot on the transparency laws. Oh, yes, sir.
So if you could go back one, something that comes up all the time is emails are sent out blind copy. And the question is, Liquor Commission, for example, sends it out. Should we give a liquor license to ABC company that wants to do it? And there's informal, I guess, vote on it. Everybody is prompted as to what they want to do.
Yeah, that shouldn't be happening.
Okay.
That shouldn't be happening, even if it's by blind copy. And we'll talk more about emails in a minute, but there shouldn't be any kind of voting. I mean, the one time I would say it's okay is like if you need to cancel a meeting and you're trying to pick another date for a meeting, and then your manager or your clerk will send out an email to someone. But as far as voting on something like that should
Subject
definitely-
matter specific stuff should
Yeah.
be saved for an open conversation here on the board.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, going to that point, we have a business wants to open up, and they want to get a liquor license. Before they go through the process, that's pretty much what I've been doing, is just to see if the board is in favor of allowing that, if the vote was to come up, to keep the petitioner from having to spend $500 to go get a background check, and then possibly even buy a building in town. Because if he goes through that process, but then the board comes up and says, no, I don't want to give him a license. In a case like that, that's still unacceptable?
So liquor licenses are a tricky thing, because so normally a community will say, we are going to authorize 100 liquor licenses, and let's say that you have 98 people with liquor licenses. If you authorize 100, you have to give the 2 licenses to whoever comes forth.
Right.
But most municipalities, to avoid that, keep their number limited.
Correct.
But if you need to have a discussion over generally whether you're going to allow more or not, because you can't do it individually like that.
Should something like that be brought up at a meeting for discussion?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah, for sure.
just as, okay. In like new business possibly, because on our agendas, we have new business.
Yeah, I mean, if people, they need to go through the process, and you really need to be transparent about that, because you don't want to be in a position where you tell someone, don't go forward with that, and then someone else is granted a license, or a business license, or a liquor license, because then they're going to be able to say, well, you were discriminatory towards them by some back channels or something. So better off if you just discuss it publicly. And there's some, really, if they apply for a business, you really need to debate whether you're going to permit it or not, because there's very few businesses you can actually turn down under your zoning code. So.
Yeah. Well,
yes.
we have a lot of companies that want to come in and say, just put gaming in, which they need a liquor license for that. I think pretty much, discussions with the board and what votes have been, and speaking to residents, especially the residents have said, we really don't want that type of business.
Then you would just pass an ordinance saying you're having a moratorium on
Yeah.
video gaming. And that way, everybody knows they're not going to get it and they don't have to waste their time. That at least is the board giving direction on that topic instead of handling it piecemeal. Because it would be really bad if you told Sue she couldn't have Susie's video gaming, but George is having, then someone later comes for it. So you should articulate what your policy is on a village-wide basis for that.
Okay.
Did you have a question too?
Well, to President Cazone's point, I mean, what we would need to do at that is have something under new business and just a line item in our agenda to allow us to speak on anybody who wants to come in for a gaming license or a liquor license. Or an example that was BCC'd previous was a gentleman, his variance was up 12 months. And the question was, do you support an extension? All those need to be in the public forum and not through blind copy, not through email, not hidden so that somebody has to FOIA it to even see it.
Yes. And once you start doing that, I think what you realize is that it's not as overwhelming as it seems. It might seem like, oh gosh, that's going to exponentially increase our board meetings, but it's not. I go to a couple villages where their board meetings, they have 2 business licenses on each time, or the variance, or, they have an area for, well, your variances, do you have a plan commission or zoning?
Planning and
Yeah,
zoning.
so, that should be just routinely under new business for you, so that would be pretty easy to clean up.
I do have a question too. And matters that where you're just generally communicating an item or a matter and not really seeking any input to the board. I've seen where there have been blind copy of boards just to prevent the contemporaneous communication in the event that there's a reply all and then there's communication back and forth via email. So that is a matter that's something different than when you're seeking a board consensus on something.
Yeah, in that instance, though, even if it's communicating information, I would rather have them just send it to everybody and then have people not respond, just so it's not like the blind carbon copy thing. I don't know.
They're notified that the entire board is on the email, BCC, but we have had situations in other municipalities where even though you say, please do not reply all to this email, just to prevent any violation of the Open Meetings Act, sometimes you just forget or they do. And so that's a measure I've seen in other municipalities, not just Villa Park.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a way that could be handled also. Yes.
Or the board could just not reply, right?
Right. Well,
They
I mean,
just
so
know.
here's the thing. There's nothing in the Open Meetings Act that says you can't reply all. We always tell people not to do that because the more frequent and close you have contemporaneous communications, the more likely they're going to say it's a meeting. But if someone inadvertently replied and then somebody replied the next day, and and it's innocuous like that, I don't think there really would be that they would find it to be a meeting. But I think that you're kind of balancing. How much do we want to avoid that controversy versus how much is it looking like we're being secretive by the blind carbon copies?
Yeah.
So, yeah. But it sounds like it's working okay the way that you're doing it, right? Or
Well, we have
think
some
so.
some board members that some take one position and some take the other. But if we can come to a consensus that, when you're receiving an email, not to reply all, maybe only reply to the writer of the email, then you're avoiding that Open Meetings Act issue, which is
Right.
which is the purpose of it.
exactly. Yes.
It seems though like if you're sending out emails soliciting some sort of response, that's what triggers that there should be in an open forum. So if you're just sending out information, the meeting's at 6 o'clock and so-and-so is going to be the speaker and here's a PDF of the information, something like that. Doesn't require a response. Nobody's going to reply all unless they say thank you. But if you're asking a question of any sort that may have the potential of some sort of dialogue going back and forth, those should be reserved for a meeting. And that should be out in the public forum so everybody can hear what that conversation may or may not be.
Well, or, I mean, I don't know what kind of questions they are, but I mean, there are other things you might be able, if a trustee has a question, you could just ask the manager could ask that person, or it could be an individual email. It doesn't have to be, unless everybody has the same question. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it sounds like you guys are doing a lot by email.
Not often.
No, okay.
Not discussion.
Okay.
I mean, from my point of view, the President Kazone has sent stuff out and tried to get input back. But what you're saying is that is discussion, even if it's input back on whether or not they think this is a viable business model, something like that.
Yeah,
that should be in the
all
public
That's
sector.
part of the legislative process, so that should be at a meeting.
Okay.
What happens when you have, say a business is coming in and is looking to buy a building for whatever reason, but they are going to end up with a liquor license. They want it kept quiet that they are buying it. They don't want it out in the public. Can something like that be done in an executive session, a discussion about that? Is that available in the
No, I mean,
executive session?
Generally, they'd have to go through like the application process with staff, and staff would have to make a recommendation.
Well, this would be before they buy a building, before they go through that whole process. To have the discussion with the board, whether or not they would be in favor, whatever. Somebody wants to come in and put a strip club in a manufacturing district, and the code allows it, and they want to have liquor. Now, that's something that would be there for discussion, but they don't want it out yet that they're going to buy this building.
But that's the whole point of public meetings. Like,
Right, but if it could affect, you have two people wanting to buy a building, if one person finds out that the other one's looking at it, that's something that they want to keep secret until they know that they're going to be able to get approval for things.
But it's not the board's or the president's job to keep things secret. Like, we represent the community. So if we have come upon information that affects the community, it is granting favors to keep something quiet so that somebody else doesn't know about it, so that somebody can maybe get an advantage in some sort of negotiation or not.
It's not to keep it quiet. It's to just determine if it is worth it for that businessman to buy, or business person to buy a particular building.
Well, they probably would still have to come before the village board, but they could, what I would do in that instance is I would say, hey, we have a concept of having a strip club in town. What does the board think about that? And not identify the particular location if it's something like that. And then they still have to go through the process. And a lot of times, often what happens is when people are buying businesses or property, it's subject to zoning approval or whatever they need, or the deal can be rescinded. But that should all be out in the open.
And just one last point, don't want to cut anybody off. Some of this stuff that's coming through there are more cases when that's an economic development issue, and a lot of that stuff is being handled by staff, so that, and then we have to have that proper balance between, what's a proprietary question not ready for public consumption versus, and then if we need to, and then we have to decide what can be actually shared under closed record and what can't be shared under closed record, and then.
Yeah, I think usually on those, you're right, the staff would do the heavy lifting as far as evaluating whether the business would even satisfy what's in the code and all of that, but.
So, sorry, just throw that little piece in there too.
So I'm not going to speak a lot about the transparency laws, but Open Meetings Act, follow the rules to go into closed session, make sure that you're discussing topics that are appropriately in closed session. You have to make a motion to go into closed session, and when you make the motion, you have to specify which exemption it is. You need a roll call vote to go into closed session, and then you need to keep minutes of the closed session and record it. So these are the proper topics, some of the proper topics. There's very many topics, but some of them have to do with like student records, and these are the most popular for public bodies. Don't be the leak. A lot of times people are saying, well, people are divulging things out of closed session. Now, interestingly, in your village code, you have a very strict section of your ethics code that talks about the release of confidential information. So you have penalties provided in that, even beyond what state law would say. And that doesn't just apply to closed session, but that would have to do with any kind of confidential information that you have access to as a board member. You do have the ability to censure the board members if they do that, seek an injunction, or people could be charged with official misconduct depending on what is divulged and the damage from that. Make sure you've all done your Open Meetings Act training. And then freedom of information, and again, that's like, a very broad overview of the things that come up the most. Freedom of Information Act, I'm not going to talk a lot about it either, but I do want to talk about emails and texts and governmental devices and accounts. So the key way to analyze whether or not your emails and text messages are public records is not what device they're on, but it's the topic of it. So if what you're talking about is not governmental business, it's not a public record. If it is about governmental business, it is a public record subject to exemptions under FOIA. And the same thing, let's see here. If it's not about governmental business, well, so here's an example. So let's say the village president's wife texts him, would you please bring home milk on the way home from the meeting tonight? That's not a public record, even though it would be on a village phone, right? But on the other hand, if you have a phone where a constituent, it's your private number, and they write to you about a member of something to do with public business, it is a public record. So just remember that. There's also a very famous case that came out of Champaign, which is really good. So the Champaign City Council, the aldermen were texting each other about how to vote during city council meetings when they had a reporter from the Tribune in the front row, okay? So that wasn't a good plan to start out with. But the reporter saw what was going on and wanted all the text messages that people sent during the meeting. And so the city said, well, no, we're not giving those out. And it went all the way up to the appellate court, and they said, well, if it was forwarded to or from a governmental account, it was sent to a majority of the board, or it was sent during a board meeting, it's a public record. So the best thing is to use your governmental accounts and devices, because if you are subject to a Freedom of Information Act request, it's easier to search for and gather the documentation. But if it's not handled that way, that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily disclosable. All right, and then we're going to conclude with just a couple things on ethics and conflicts of interest. All right, so you all know about that Statement of Economic Interest form, which the General Assembly modified in a terrible, horrible way like 2 years ago. So now people have to disclose all of these things. We've actually had people resigning from office because of things they've had to disclose on this. You have to make sure you file that annually in May, so you've probably already done that this year. Now, you have special ethics ordinances in 2 divisions of your village code. And these are the topics that they address: interest in contracts, Gift Ban Act, confidential information, as we talked about, incompatible offices, using public property for private purposes, sexual harassment, these things. If you haven't reviewed your ethics ordinances, you should, just so you know what all those rules are. You kind of mirror the Gift Ban Act. So you cannot accept gifts from prohibited sources. Gifts are anything of value. A prohibited source is anyone that's doing business with the village or seeking to. And this also applies to members of your household. Now, we have a situation where we represent a village that owns a golf course, and the managing company from the golf course invited one of the trustees to the Masters. So he went to the Masters with it and had his tickets paid for, his airfare, his hotel, and he came back and we had to tell him, guess what? You just did business with a prohibited source. You have to make a charitable donation, and the amount of all of that. So now there are a lot of exceptions to the Gift Ban Act. These are some of them. A lot of them are related for food, but like, items from a prohibited source that's $100 or less a year. So if your village attorney sends you popcorn at Christmas time, that's fine if it's under $100. So anyway, and then, if you're given a discount by a vendor, but everybody that shops at that store is getting the same discount, that's okay. And again, we could spend an hour just on the Gift Ban Act alone. So just be familiar with that. There are all sorts of conflicts of interest statute. There's a public official statute that says that you cannot have a direct or indirect pecuniary or financial interest in any contract that you vote on. So be careful about that, because if there is some kind of conflict, just abstaining from the vote is not enough under the conflict laws. And then here are some just exemptions, like sometimes, let's say that you have a retirement account and it invests, one of the investments is ComEd, and the village is contracting with ComEd. That's okay, if it's like really a small interest and things like that. But the problems come up when people own companies. I had a township supervisor. Before she was supervisor, she owned a sign company in town. The township ordered all its signs from the sign company. She got an office, the sign broke down, she sent it to her company for repairs, and the state's attorney called her. Because even though it was a dinky little repair of a sign, it was like a conflict of interest. So those are the things you have to be careful of. So that's like kind of it. So which of your questions did I not cover?
Yeah, any other questions from the board? Trustee Patrick?
Will we be able to get a copy of your presentation?
Yes, I'm going to take out that one slide that had a partial sentence, but yes.
Thank you.
I will send that to you.
Great, thanks.
Anything else?
Seeing none, well, thank you. I appreciate your time. It was very
Well, I
informative.
hope it helped. Thanks for having me come out.
Thank you.
there
Thanks
are
for
any other-
keeping it an hour, too.
If there's any follow-up questions, then we can either send them to me and I can get them to you or to Melissa. Oh, not that,
And we won't reply all.
yeah.
Great, thank you.
She won't be CC'd.
Okay, so with that, do we have a motion for adjournment?
I'll make that motion.
Trustee Cordova, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Trustee Alfano, all in favor?
Aye.
Yeah, what did we say? Yeah, all in favor. Aye. Thank you. Okay, we will reopen a regular board meeting in 10 minutes at 10 after 7.
Let's see if anyone's opposed.